This week on Drunk on Tea, I have some heads on sticks, some eyes get painted, and things go horribly wrong. In a previous video, I tested a new way for painting faces by using yellow, red and blue as undershading and then glazing a skin tone over the top. This was the first time I had tried this method and I was pleasantly surprised by the results, giving a really nice realistic skin tone with some natural variation in the right places. This week I'm going to test out some possible extra steps to see if this method can produce even better results or if just keeping it simple is the best idea. I've prepared 4 heads to test 4 different possible effects. One, I'm going to apply a shade before the glaze to see if it brings out more details. The second, I'm going to apply some extra highlights after the glaze. The third, I'm going to try a speed paint over the undershading to see what happens. And finally, I'm going to apply a speed paint after the glaze to see if I can add more definition but keep the undershading effect. First, I need to paint the effect onto all 4 of these heads. If you haven't seen the first video where I go into detail how to paint the undershade, I'll add a card to it here and a link in the description. I'm making sure I get a solid layer of each colour band on the model, and this time I'm bringing the red over the eyebrows and the lips more, so it should have a greater effect on these heads than on the original one I painted last time. Although all 4 of these heads are slightly different, the bands still go in the same places on all 4 of them. It's just a few of the details on each one that vary slightly. With all 4 heads underpainted, I have the bright bands on them all that I've built up to solid layers. Now it's time to test out these effects and see if I can improve on the results I achieved by just glazing over these faces. For the first head, I'm using Reichland Flesh Shade, and I'm applying this all over the face before adding the skin tone. I want to make sure I cover all of the face and this doesn't pull too heavily. The idea is that this skin tone will sink into the recesses and add even more depth and definition to the face, which will also show through after glazing on the skin tone. Once the shade has dried, you can see how it's darkened down the colour bands on the face a bit, but also brought out some of the details as well. Now with Cadian Flesh Tone, I'm going to glaze this all over the skin. I want to work in thin layers so the colours will still show through and build up the glaze until I have a solid looking skin tone, but without full opacity and a bit of the undershading is still visible. I'm glazing over the colours and the flesh shade, but hoping that the darker areas in the recesses will still show through, bringing definition to the face as well as the natural skin tones of the undershade. It will take me about 3 layers of Cadian Flesh Tone until I get a result that I'm finally happy with. This is the end result. Although the shade has given a bit more definition to the face, it's also muted the colours of the underpainting and reduced the effect. The skin looks a lot more monotone rather than the realistic effect that I achieved with just the glaze over the underpaint. Now with another head, I'm going to apply some finishing highlights after applying the glaze layers. First, with Cadian Flesh Tone, I'm applying the glaze layers all over the face. I'm waiting for each layer to fully dry before adding another layer of thinned down Cadian Flesh Tone, so I should end up with a result similar to the head I painted in my previous video. Where those colours haven't been muted down by the shade this time, they are a lot brighter and show through more underneath the glazed on skin. But I want to glaze on enough layers so that banding isn't visible anymore, just a subtle hint of colour that's underneath. With the glaze applied, you can see that colour variation on the face, with the forehead being bright and the nose and cheeks having a nice reddish tint, like there is increased blood flow in these parts. Now with Kislev Flesh, I'm going to apply some highlights on the sharpest details on the face. I'm catching areas like the bridge of the nose and the eyebrows, keeping these highlights nice and small. I'm also catching any details like the cheeks and any creases or folds in the skin. This slightly brighter highlight should make these details a bit more noticeable on the model and add a bit more contrast to the face by brightening up some of the areas that would catch the light the most. As always, keeping these highlights nice and small and focusing them onto the details of the face. With the highlights applied, the undershading is still showing through, but some of the key details have become a bit more noticeable. For the third face, I'm going to apply a flesh speed paint directly over the undershade to see if it will give an even skin tone, but also add some shading. Of course, a contrast paint would also work the same for this. I'm using Crusader Skin for this test, and I'm applying some all over the face. I'm making sure I apply this all over the face and letting it sink into the details. Because of the transparency of speed paints, it may take quite a few layers to get full coverage. After the first layer has dried, it's not done a lot, so I'm adding another layer of speed paint to see if I can cover the bands of colour and get a skin tone on top. After a few layers, all that's happened is the bands are getting darker, but there still isn't a flesh tone to the face yet. So I'm going to apply even more layers of speed paint to see if I can get any form of skin colour to show through over the underpainting, or if this will just keep making the bands of colour darker and darker. After several layers, the bands of colour are still clearly visible, and all I've done is added a reddish hint and darkened down the other colours, so this test is a complete and utter fail. With the final head, I'm going to test the speed paint again, but after I've glazed on the skin tone. So with Cadian flesh tone again, I'm glazing this all over the skin in a few layers until I get a semi-opaque finish with the undershading still showing through, and adding those colours to the skin as I did before. After the glaze, I've got that nice looking skin tone and colour variation all over the face to the model, with the undershade just showing through from beneath the glaze. Now with Crusader Skin, which I'm thinning down ever so slightly with some water so it's not too stark, I'm applying this all over the skin. This should act a bit like a shade, bringing out the definition, but also be thin enough so the undershading will still show through, giving me extra depth without losing the effect that I achieved with the bands of colours. With the speed paint dried, it has really brought out the details to the face. Although it has hidden the effect of the undershade slightly, there is still some tonal difference between the areas of the face. Perhaps making the paint even thinner would have reduced the staining more to allow more of these colours to show through. Here are the four heads together, but to really compare them, I need to paint the rest of the details like the hair and eyes, so it's not just a skin tone surrounded by black and they look a bit tidier. So I'm painting the details around the back of the Space Marine's head, painting this blue as I did an Ultramarine before, and shading the details. I'm picking out any hair details with grey or stippling some on to give the impression of hair, and carefully painting the eyes. Once again, I go into more detail about painting eyes in my original video where I tested this method, so if you want to see that, please check out the original video. With the details painted, the faces all look a lot better, but some of these heads have scar details on them, so as a little bonus, I'll show you my quick method for painting scars on models. The head I shaded before applying the glaze has this big scar stretching down from his forehead to just past his right eye and onto the cheek, and there's a really simple way to make this stand out. With Cammerborg Crimson shade paint, I'm using a brush with a really fine tip on it, and I'm sinking a little bit of the shade into the recess for that scar. This will give the colour of a slightly healed wound and really make it stand out, but I'm being careful as I apply this so I don't overspill and get any of the shade on the rest of the face. And with that applied, it has brought out the scar on the face. The shade before the glaze has washed out the undershading somewhat, and the finished head doesn't have that detail that the original one had, although it has made the recesses darker, but it's lost the colour of the undershade. The extra highlights work well and add more detail and keep the undershading effect, so this is a possible extra step if you want to push your faces up a bit more than just the undershade and glaze method. The speed paint hasn't worked at all, although it has given more of an impression of a war paint on the model. So if you wanted to paint minis that have some sort of tribal markings or face paint, applying the markings you want and then a few layers of speed paint could work well. Maybe this is something I'll explore more in the future to create a war paint look on skin. And finally, the glaze and thin speed paint has given a really nice result. Although the undershading is a lot more subtle here because of the extra colours added, it is still visible, and because of the extra definition brought out by the speed paint, there's a lot more detail on the face. And these are the finished heads all together. I think the extra highlights and the speed paint after the glaze give the best results. But let me know in the comments below, what do you think works best? And are there any other techniques or things you would like to see me try? Thank you very much for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and happy painting!